Boeing just lost over $2 billion on one spacecraft. Starliner was supposed to fly astronauts in 2017. 10 years later, it's still grounded, while NASA quietly hands its astronauts to SpaceX instead. Here's the twist. NASA hates this failure, but NASA refuses to cancel it. Why would anyone keep funding a $2 billion disaster? The answer involves rockets that can't be reassigned, and a risk NASA fears more than losing money. Stay with me. This story gets stranger. June 5th, 2024. Two astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, strap into Starliner for what NASA calls a routine test flight. 8 days at the International Space Station, then home. That's the plan. It does not go according to plan. Within hours of launch, engineers on the ground start seeing numbers they don't like. Helium is leaking, not a lot at first, but it doesn't stop. Then the reaction control thrusters, the small engines that steer the spacecraft, start overheating. 5 of them shut down during final approach to the station. Let that sink in. 5 steering thrusters failing, while a spacecraft with 2 humans on board tries to dock with a 250-mile-per-hour laboratory in orbit. Wilmore and Williams still make it, barely. NASA calls it a success at the time. But behind the scenes, engineers are running the numbers again and again and again. By the time NASA finishes its analysis, the agency has logged roughly 100 separate anomalies from that single flight. 100. For a spacecraft designed to fly humans safely to a space station and back, that number should terrify you. It terrified NASA. So NASA makes a decision nobody wants to make. Wilmore and Williams will not fly home on Starliner. Instead, they wait for 9 months, riding home eventually on a SpaceX Crew Dragon capsule built by Boeing's biggest rival. An 8-day mission became a 9-month ordeal, not because of a single explosion, not because of a single dramatic failure, but because of thrusters that quietly, stubbornly refused to behave the way engineers predicted. So what actually went wrong? And why couldn't Boeing, one of the most experienced aerospace companies on Earth, catch this before 2 astronauts were stuck in orbit? The flaw hiding inside the doghouse. This is where the story stops being simple. Boeing's engineers eventually traced the thruster failures to something called the Doghouse, a compartment on Starliner's service module that houses clusters of small engines. Inside those doghouses, oxidizer vapor was slowly seeping across seals that weren't designed to handle that kind of exposure. Heat builds up, seals degrade, thrusters misfire or shut down entirely. Think of it like a car engine overheating because a single gasket was rated for the wrong temperature. Small oversight, massive consequence. NASA's own investigators later confirmed something even more uncomfortable. This wasn't just a hardware problem, it was a mindset problem. NASA's Office of Inspector General published a report placing blame on both sides. Boeing and NASA, the report says, placed too much confidence in heritage systems, meaning technology carried over from older, proven programs. The assumption was simple. If it worked before, it will work again. Except Starliner isn't just an old design bolted onto a new capsule. It's a new integration of old and new technology, and that integration was never tested as thoroughly as it needed to be. Limited simulation, limited flight testing. Real-world conditions kept revealing problems that ground tests never caught. Compare that to SpaceX. Before Crew Dragon ever carried a human, SpaceX had already flown Cargo Dragon to the space station repeatedly, learning lessons the hard way on uncrewed missions where mistakes cost money instead of lives. Boeing didn't have that luxury. Much of Starliner's hardest lessons were learned during the crew vehicle's actual development, sometimes during flights that already had astronauts strapped inside. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every technical explanation. The problem wasn't just engineering, it was how much Boeing and NASA trusted engineering they hadn't fully proven. And that mistake has a price tag. The people caught in the middle. Boeing's commercial crew contract with NASA was originally worth roughly $4.2 billion. A fixed-price deal meant to reward efficiency. Fixed-price contracts sound simple. Boeing agreed to deliver a certain number of crewed flights for a set amount of money. If Boeing goes over budget, that overage comes out of Boeing's own pocket, not NASA's. Nearly a decade of redesigns, delays, and failed tests later, Boeing has burned through more than $2 billion beyond what NASA is paying. $2 billion in losses on a program that was supposed to be profitable. And the punishment doesn't stop with money. NASA originally guaranteed Boeing 6 operational crew missions once Starliner is certified. That number has already been cut to 4. The very next flight, Starliner 1, has been converted from a crewed mission into a cargo-only flight, stripping away even more revenue and, more importantly, more chances for Boeing to prove the spacecraft actually works. With fewer guaranteed missions, analysts estimate the effective value of Boeing's contract has dropped by roughly $500 million. NASA has already paid Boeing close to $2.2 billion in development milestones. That leaves a shrinking pool of money tied to missions Boeing hasn't even flown yet. This is the number that should worry Boeing most. The International Space Station is expected to retire around 2030, possibly extended to 2032 if Congress steps in. And every year Starliner slips further behind schedule. That retirement date gets closer, while the finish line for certification keeps moving further away. Do the math yourself. A program with a shrinking runway and a moving finish line does not have unlimited chances left. Some aerospace analysts are now asking the question publicly, will Starliner ever complete a single operational crew rotation to the space station before that station is gone for good? That question used to sound dramatic. It doesn't anymore. The people caught in the middle. Every delay, every anomaly, every redesign in the story has a name attached to it somewhere. Wilmore and Williams didn't sign up for a 9-month mission. Their families didn't plan for that either. NASA had to publicly explain again and again why 2 of its astronauts were living on a space station far longer than intended, using a competitor's spacecraft to eventually bring them home. Boeing's own workforce isn't untouched. A program bleeding that much money doesn't just hurt a balance sheet. It puts pressure on engineering teams, on leadership decisions, on every future contract Boeing bids for. Aerospace companies compete for trust as much as they compete for technology. Every headline about Starliner's failures chips away at that trust. And then there's United Launch Alliance, a company you might not think about in this story at all. But ULA is deeply entangled in Starliner's fate, and this is where the story takes its sharpest turn. ULA builds the Atlas V rocket, the launch vehicle Starliner rides into orbit. Atlas V is being retired. SpaceX and newer rockets like Vulcan have made it increasingly obsolete. But here's the catch. ULA still has 6 Atlas V rockets sitting in inventory, and every single one of them was built specifically, physically, for Starliner missions. Those rockets cannot simply be handed to another customer. Why not? Because Starliner launches without a payload fairing, the protective nose cone that almost every satellite mission requires. Atlas V stopped producing fairings years ago. The manufacturing tooling has likely already been scrapped. Vulcan's new fairings aren't even compatible with the older Atlas airframe. On top of that, these remaining rockets use a dual-engine Centaur upper stage, a configuration optimized specifically for low-orbit missions like Starliner, not the deep space missions most modern satellite customers need. ULA even has just enough solid rocket boosters left in inventory to cover exactly 6 final Starliner launches. Not 5, not 7. 6. In other words, an entire slice of America's launch infrastructure has been built, purchased, and locked into place around one troubled spacecraft. If NASA cancels Starliner tomorrow, those 6 rockets become expensive, unusable metal. Canceling Starliner doesn't just hurt Boeing. It ripples straight through ULA and from ULA into every other program that depends on America's launch capacity. That's the first hidden reason NASA can't simply pull the plug. The second reason is even bigger. The one rule NASA refuses to break. Right now, in 2026, SpaceX's Crew Dragon is the only operational American spacecraft certified to carry astronauts to the International Space Station. The only one. Rewind to when NASA first created the Commercial Crew program. The entire point of funding 2 separate companies, Boeing and SpaceX, was to avoid exactly this situation. Total dependence on a single spacecraft, built by a single company, with zero backup if something goes wrong. If Crew Dragon ever gets grounded, even temporarily, for a technical issue, a launch failure, anything, NASA needs a second option ready to go. Right now, that second option doesn't functionally exist. Starliner is grounded. Dream Chaser, Sierra Space's lifting body spacecraft built for cargo and eventually crew, hasn't even reached orbit yet. So NASA is stuck holding on to a $2 billion failure, not because Starliner has earned that trust back, but because losing it entirely would leave the United States with exactly one working way to get astronauts into space. That's the paradox nobody puts in the headline. Starliner is too broken to trust and too important to lose. This part of the story didn't exist a year ago. A fresh watchdog report from NASA's Office of Inspector General, released in the first days of July 2026, lays out the most detailed accounting yet of how bad things have become. The combined value of NASA's contracts with SpaceX and Boeing has now grown past $8 billion total, a number that keeps climbing every time a mission slips. The same report flags more than $127 million in Boeing payments that investigators are now disputing, questioning whether NASA paid for work that wasn't actually completed to standard. As of March 2026, the helium leaks and thruster failures that stranded Wilmore and Williams still aren't fully resolved. Engineers are still testing seal materials at NASA's White Sands facility, trying to find a fix robust enough to trust with human lives again. And now, for the first time, the certification date is on the record. What was once framed as a 2026 return to flight has quietly shifted toward 2027, pushing Starliner a full decade past its original target of 2017. A decade. Confirmed, not estimated. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Despite every failure, every leaked report, every billion-dollar loss, NASA's own audit concluded something almost nobody expected. Keeping Starliner alive, even in this condition, is still calculated to be cheaper for NASA than abandoning it entirely and rebuilding that capacity from scratch with a different provider. Read that again. Cheaper to keep funding a broken spacecraft than to walk away from it. That's not stubbornness. That's math. Painful, uncomfortable math, but math nonetheless. The case for going slow. Every headline about Starliner reads like an obituary. Broken spacecraft, wasted billions, a program that should have been canceled years ago. But hold on. Before writing Starliner off completely, it's worth asking a question almost nobody in the space community wants to ask out loud. What if grounding Starliner for this long, painful as it looks, is actually the responsible decision, not the failed one? Consider the comparison that gets buried under all the bad headlines. NASA lost the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003 because engineers noticed a problem, foam strike damage, and leadership decided it probably wasn't serious enough to act on. 14 people were wrong about probably. 7 astronauts died. Now look at how NASA handled Starliner's thruster anomalies in 2024. The moment engineers saw numbers they didn't fully understand, NASA didn't gamble on probably fine. The agency grounded the return flight, brought in a competitor's spacecraft, and accepted 9 months of embarrassing headlines rather than risk 2 lives on unresolved uncertainty. That's not the same agency that flew Columbia against warning signs. That's an agency that appears to have actually learned something. Slow and grounded isn't always the same as broken. Sometimes it's the exact opposite of the mistake that killed people before. There's a second point worth making too, one that almost never shows up in coverage this critical. Every single anomaly Boeing and NASA catalog from Starliner's flights, all 100 of them, becomes permanent knowledge for the entire American space industry. Seal materials that fail under oxidizer exposure. Thruster placement that creates unexpected heat buildup. These aren't just Boeing's problems anymore. They're documented, studied, and folded into how every future spacecraft in this class gets designed, including, ironically, spacecraft built by Boeing's competitors. Painful lessons, but lessons that make the next generation of American spacecraft safer. That's a form of progress, even if it doesn't feel like one from the outside. None of this erases the billions in losses, or the decade of missed deadlines, or the very real frustration NASA has expressed about Boeing's management decisions. Those problems are real, and they're documented in NASA's own reports, not manufactured by critics. But the full picture isn't just failure. It's a slower, more expensive, more cautious version of the same commercial crew strategy that eventually made SpaceX successful too, just running years behind schedule and burning through far more money along the way. The question nobody can answer yet. So where does that leave Starliner in 2026? Grounded, unproven, carrying a decade of delays and billions in losses. Tangled into ULA's remaining rocket inventory. wrapped up in a NASA policy that refuses to rely on a single spacecraft, no matter how good that spacecraft currently is. Boeing insists Starliner will fly astronauts again. NASA insists the program is still worth funding. The numbers, the anomalies, and the timeline all suggest a much harder truth underneath those statements. Every year, Starliner stays grounded, the space station gets closer to retirement, the window to prove the spacecraft was worth building gets smaller, and the pressure on Boeing to either deliver or walk away only grows heavier. Which raises the real question hanging over this entire program. Is NASA protecting a spacecraft that will eventually justify a decade of losses? Or is NASA protecting a decision it's no longer able to reverse? The numbers don't lie, and neither will I. Thanks for breaking this down with me. I'm Adrian, the Space Brief. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and check the video on your screen now.